During this video, we're going to go more in depth into how to do a full art criticism.
So when we talk about art criticism, we are talking about how people respond to art, how we interpret the meaning of art, and how we make critical judgments about art. But one misconception about art criticism is that it is often considered to be negative, but in fact can be positive and negative. And criticism can be about both contemporary art and also historical works. Okay, the next thing we want to maybe talk about is who are art critics. Art critics can be professionals such as journalists or people who write for scholarly magazines and analyze art, but in general they can be people from the public just like you who are looking at works of art and judging it. So there are 4 different levels of analysis or art criticism, and we've talked about these previously, so this is kind of a review. But the 4 levels of art criticism are description, analysis, interpretation, and judgment. And we're going to go through each one of these now. The first level of art criticism is description, and it answers the question, what do we see? And during description, basically what you're doing is you're looking at the actual piece of art and you're describing the physical components of it. You're not doing any sort of analysis or value judgment of it. Some of the things that we use to build the description during an art criticism are, we look at what's the form of the art. Is it architecture, photography, sculpture, painting? We might look at the medium that was being used. We might look at the size or the scale of the work. We don't do analysis of the painting or the artwork, but we might talk about how things are positioned in the artwork and things like that. Okay, so I chose the Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh as a painting that we could give a description for. And so in this particular painting, one of the things we might talk about is the color palette and talk about how we have some contrasting colors here. We might talk about the actual lines because lines are very important for this particular painting. We might talk about the direction and how direction kind of shows movement. We also might talk about the contrasting shapes in the painting, so you can see the more geometric shapes in the background with the village, and then the more organic shape in the front, which is the landscape. And then we might also talk about the fact that this is an oil on canvas painting. Okay, the second level of art criticism has the purpose of answering the question, how did the artist actually do it? So some of the elements that we would focus on for the analysis of level 2 is we might look at the subject matter and look at the timeline at which it was created. Was it based off of a historical event or mythology or an iconic element? We also would focus on some very distinctive features that are in that particular piece of art. We are going to look at the principles of art and design. We're going to look at lighting, maybe how movement is shown in there, the effects of the medium being used, any perceptions of balance, proportion, and scale, and a reaction to even the focal topic or the object, how people are responding to that. So for an example of how to do an analysis, I chose the Capitoline Wolf. This is a kind of interesting sculpture for a couple of different reasons. It is depicting the Roman mythology story of Romulus and Remus, who were raised by a she-wolf. There are some very distinct features in this, and one of the things that you might notice, just even if you're not familiar with it, is that the wolf kind of looks as if she's from a different time period than Romulus and Remus, the 2 twins. And there is some debate about whether perhaps the wolf was created previous to Romulus and Remus, and then the twins were added later. The sculpture is intended for a 360-degree viewing, so it's, you can see stuff all around the whole outside. Principles of design are incorporated in here that we might want to focus on, and that would be looking at, for instance, the wolf. The head of the wolf appears to be much more dominant and larger, almost out of proportion to the remaining part of the body, so maybe there was wanting to be a focus on that. And another interesting fact about this particular sculpture is that the wolf was cast in bronze, but it was cast using a totally different method than the twins were cast in iron. So that's kind of interesting. All right, the third level of art criticism is interpretation. And we want to answer the question, why did the artist create the artwork, and what does the artwork mean? So for the interpretation process, it's a little bit tricky because you're basically using your knowledge that you have about the elements of art to formulate an opinion about what you think the artwork is about, and you're going to support that opinion with evidence. And so that's what happens. So in this case, you can, why did the artist create it? Express what you think the artwork means in a couple of sentences, and then provide evidence to support that interpretation. One of my favorite artists is Andrew Wyeth, and also his father, N.C. Wyeth, and I think I just really enjoy this work because it's very realistic. But this one is called Christina's World, and the interpretation of this one is that the artist, Andrew Wyeth, his father had just died a few months prior to making this painting, and Andrew Wyeth was also really good friends with his neighbor Christina, who had a disorder that was debilitating for her, and so instead of using a wheelchair, she actually often crawled around on the farm area between their farms. And so this particular painting, you can see that the grass is kind of dead looking, or it's maybe towards the end of the farming season, and that's showing kind of the end of life, maybe talking a little bit about grief in it. So that would be an interpretation of this painting. The fourth level of art criticism is judgment, and this is kind of the fun part. It's where you say, is this artwork good? And when I say, is this artwork good, it's also a personal interpretation. Somebody really might like some artwork, and then another person might not. There is obviously some degree of being able to have a popularity and have many people like it, so that way you can sell the product. But in general, it's based off of a personal feeling, a personal opinion. So it's important to kind of have two things in mind when you're making a judgment about a piece of artwork. The first is, what criteria is most appropriate for judging that artwork? And again, this is going to be a little bit of personal opinion, because you might really like things that are very colorful, and another person might like to have something that looks realistic versus somebody likes abstract. So you kind of have to have that criteria in your mind. And then once you have that, you use the criterion to actually help you make a judgment about the quality of the work. I chose The Girl Before a Mirror by Pablo Picasso for the judgment portion of the art criticism. And the criteria that I was looking for was something that was colorful, that had a meaningful theme, and also had really good composition. So in this particular painting, I liked the composition. I liked the fact that the images took up the majority of the space. I really liked the colors that were in there, and you can see on the left side that the younger person is in brighter colors, and the older person is going to be sort of in more muted colors. And the theme or the meaning behind this is a picture of a woman looking at herself in a mirror and seeing what she would look like as an older person. And I just really liked that concept. So the final thing I want to touch on is Barrett's principles of interpretation, and these are just some general rules that can help us when we're discussing artwork. Barrett talks about the fact that artwork demands interpretation, and some of that interpretation or analysis is better than others. There should be evidence that is used to make those interpretations. And of course, Barrett talks also about the fact that there could be different or competing or contradictory interpretations for the same exact painting. Another thing we should focus on is making an interpretation of the artwork in its best light rather than its weakest light. And I think this next one is really important, where we should be focusing on the artwork and doing an interpretation of the artwork and not the artist. And then finally, it's really, really important to understand that interpretation is a communal endeavor, which means that it takes everybody getting involved and saying, hey, I really like this piece, and here's the reason why, and kind of talking about it and hashing it out. And it's sort of ever-changing as people, look at it and over time. Okay, that's the end of this set of notes, and I hope you will find the information in these notes useful in doing your own art criticism as we progress through the class.